Good morning. My name is Gregg Oneal. I'm a member of the AC2 BFG and also one of your new deacons. And it's time now for another episode of Devotionables, brief devotions for busy people. Today I'm going to be covering Acts 22 through 24. And as a way of background, we learned in Acts 21 that Paul got in a little trouble as being dragged out of the temple by an unruly crowd who thought he tried to sneak a Gentile into the temple. And some Roman soldiers have come to arrest him. And as Paul's being taken away, he asked if he could speak to the crowd. And that brings us up to Acts 22. Paul quiets the crowd, and he tells his story of his life before Jesus and his conversion. He begins by saying in verse 1, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And he goes on to share his Damascus Road experience, where a great light from heaven shone around him, and he was blinded physically. He shares about a man named Ananias and how he came to Paul, then called Saul, and helped him receive his sight. Now there are three men named Ananias mentioned in the book of Acts, and two of them are mentioned in our chapters today. The first mentioned in Acts 5 was the Ananias who, along with his wife Sapphira, lied about how much money they sold their property for and dropped dead because basically they lied to God. Next we have the Ananias noted in Acts 9, and again today in Acts 22. And he was the one who came to Saul after he was blinded. Of the three, this is the good Ananias, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. And the third Ananias, who shows up in Acts 23 and 24, is the current high priest who wants Paul arrested and killed. So back to Paul's defense in verse 1. He finishes telling about his Damascus Road experience. And then, starting in verse 17, he tells them about a time when Jesus spoke to him and told him he was going to go to the Gentiles. And the crowd goes nuts again because they did not believe God would save the Gentiles too, and the soldiers have to take him away. So Paul did not get to finish his message or his testimony. From this point on, Paul is no longer free. For the rest of the book of Acts, he is in Roman custody. Next, he gets the opportunity to speak before the Sanhedrin, the council, and the high priest, the third Ananias. He realizes the crowd is made up of Sadducees and Pharisees, and he tells them he's a Pharisee, and his dad is a Pharisee, and that he believes in the resurrection, which stirs the crowd up even more because the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrections. And the soldier has to pull him out again. And again, he does not get to finish his message. It seems he messed up. He did not say all the right words. We're so accustomed to seeing Paul successful in reaching the lost. But today's scriptures reminds us that even Paul was not perfect when witnessing. Scripture does not tell us what Paul was thinking at this time, but he was probably disappointed that he did not get to finish his testimony. And perhaps maybe he used the wrong words. But in Acts 23:11, something cool happens. Verse 11 says, "The following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem. So you must testify also in Rome.'" Nothing like getting a pep talk from the Lord himself. God had more for Paul to do. Next, Paul is sent to Felix the governor, where the high priest Ananias and his lawyer make charges against Paul. But then Paul gets time for rebuttal, and he gives his testimony to Felix. And even though he keeps Paul in prison, Paul gets several opportunities to share his faith with Felix and his wife Drusilla. And that's a quick summary of Acts 22 to 24. Paul and Ananias faced various challenges, and a theme that stood out to me in these chapters is that they were both ready and prepared to do what the Lord called them to do. Being ready, being prepared resonated with me. For my career, I spent over 40 years working for the Defense Department in the Air Force, and the most important task we had was mission readiness. The definition of readiness is 1, the state of being fully prepared for something, and 2, willingness to do something. Our military strives to be ready for whatever mission they are called to do. To do this, to be prepared, to be ready, it takes time, it takes study, it takes practice. You know, the Bible in essence is about getting us ready and prepared to serve. There are several verses that speak to being ready or being prepared. A couple of excerpts. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. From today's chapters and really throughout the book of Acts, we see Paul always ready to give a defense for what he believed. In Matthew 24 and Luke 12, Jesus tells us to be ready for his return. Matthew 24, 42 to 44, "Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake, and he would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect." The way to be on guard against a thief and the way to be ready for Jesus' return is to live in constant readiness. And back to Ananias for a second, the good Ananias. In Acts 22:12, Paul describes Ananias as a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. In Acts 9:10, he was described as a disciple. The definition of disciple is someone who is following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, and is committed to the mission of Jesus. That word mission, that resonates with me too. And we learn back in Acts 9 that when the Lord called Ananias, that he responded with, "Here I am, Lord." He was ready to answer the call. Now, it was not without some trepidation, because the Lord asked Ananias to go lay hands on Saul, who was known for persecuting Christians. So he was a little fearful, but the Lord tells him to go, and Ananias follows the Lord's command. Ananias was prepared. He was ready when the Lord called him into action. He played a small but significant part in carrying out the Lord's mission. Do you remember the children's song in Sunday school called "The Lord's Army," where we sang about things we may never do, but we were still in the Lord's army? We may not be called into situations like Paul or Ananias, but we are called to share our faith. When I focus on Jesus returning, I think about friends and family who do not know Jesus. As we enter the Christmas season, we will have opportunities to spend time with coworkers, neighbors, family and friends, members who are not followers of Jesus. I want to challenge us to be ready, to be prepared, to be available for the Lord to use us. Being the Lord's army is not always easy, but we can do hard things when we are prepared. As we saw in today's scripture, not everyone responded to Paul's testimony in a positive manner. And his words were not always perfect, but he did not let that stop him. He kept sharing his testimony at every opportunity. The same goes for us. Our mission is to share about Jesus. So be prepared to make a defense like Paul. Be ready to answer the call like Ananias.